In 1926, a socialist leader was captured by Mussolini's Blackshirts outside his home in northern Italy. They stripped him naked, beat him unconscious, and then, while he was still breathing, poured burning castor oil down his throat until his insides bled. This wasn't a random act of cruelty. This was state policy. This was Mussolini's Italy. Behind the propaganda of trains running on time and a modernizing nation lay a systematic campaign of torture that broke bodies and minds to build fascism's empire. Today, we reveal the forgotten methods Mussolini used to terrorize an entire nation into submission. Methods so effective, they were later adopted by dictators worldwide. Welcome to the infamous past, where we uncover Mussolini's darkest moments. If history's darkest chapters fascinate you, don't forget to subscribe. When we think of 20th century atrocities, Hitler's concentration camps and Stalin's gulags dominate our collective memory. But in the shadow of these horrors, Benito Mussolini pioneered psychological and physical torture techniques that would become the blueprint for authoritarian control across Europe. From 1922 to 1945, Il Duce transformed Italy from a struggling democracy into a fascist state where torture wasn't just permitted, it was perfected. His regime developed a sophisticated understanding of how pain could be weaponized, not just to punish enemies, but to terrorize the masses into compliance. Today we'll examine 5 torture methods that defined Mussolini's rule, techniques deliberately designed to maximize both physical suffering and psychological devastation. These weren't just acts of brutality, they were calculated tools of governance that kept millions of Italians in a perpetual state of fear. The rise of squadrismo. Before we explore specific torture methods, we must understand how violence became institutionalized in fascist Italy. The seeds were planted in 1919 with the birth of squadrismo, paramilitary squads known as Blackshirts, who operated with increasing impunity. Alessandro Saluppo, a leading historian of fascist violence, describes how these squads developed a ritualized approach to violence. Squadristi presented themselves as members of an embattled community of political soldiers fighting a heroic struggle against an absolute enemy. The Blackshirts initially targeted socialist politicians, union leaders, and newspaper editors. Their early attacks followed a pattern. They would arrive in trucks at night, surround a target's home, and drag them into the street for a public lesson. One particularly brutal technique was the passaggio indiano, or Indian passage, forcing victims to run a gauntlet between 2 lines of squadristi, who beat them with iron-tipped clubs and metal rods. This wasn't random violence. It was theatrical punishment designed to be witnessed. By 1921, squadrismo had evolved from street brawling to systematic terror. In the Po Valley, squads would isolate entire villages, cutting telephone lines and blocking roads before launching what they called punitive expeditions. During these raids, they would destroy labor union offices, burn socialist newspapers, and publicly torture local leaders. What made this violence particularly effective was its unpredictability. As one police inspector from Polsine reported in April 1921, fascists have committed themselves to manhunts, and not a day goes by in which they do not chase, confront, beat, and abuse those who belong to the socialist organizations. People who truly, in some places, are so traumatized and frightened, one could even say terrorized, that they completely avoid public places and never leave their homes. This climate of fear was precisely what Mussolini needed to seize power in 1922. But once in control, he would refine these crude methods into something far more sinister. The castor oil torture. Perhaps the most infamous torture method associated with Mussolini's regime was the forced administration of castor oil, a technique that combined physical agony with profound humiliation. The procedure was brutally simple. Victims were captured and brought to a public place, often the town square. There, they were restrained while Blackshirts forced them to drink up to a liter of castor oil, a powerful laxative. The immediate effects were violent stomach cramps and uncontrollable diarrhea. But The physical pain was only part of the torture. The real power lay in the public humiliation that followed. Victims would soil themselves in public, often while being paraded through town. The psychological trauma of this public degradation was devastating, especially in a society where personal dignity and honor were paramount. Gabriele D'Annunzio, a nationalist poet and early fascist supporter, is credited with pioneering this technique. The Blackshirts called it a patriotic baptism, a perverse ritual of purification. As Il Popolo d'Italia, Mussolini's newspaper, cynically wrote in September 1921, the ingestion of a good glass of castor oil serves to purify them of their wrongdoings and old sins of Bolshevism. The genius of this torture method was its blend of physical suffering, public humiliation, and symbolic meaning. It communicated that the regime could violate not just your body, but your dignity, and do so with the approval of your neighbors. In some cases, the castor oil was mixed with gasoline, motor oil, or even tincture of iodine, causing severe internal burns. Many victims died from dehydration or internal bleeding. Those who survived carried both physical scars and deep psychological trauma. What made this torture particularly effective was that it transformed ordinary citizens into unwilling participants. When a person was forced to soil themselves in public, everyone who witnessed it became part of the spectacle, either as horrified onlookers or as those who turned away. This collective experience of shame and powerlessness helped break community solidarity and resistance. Confino, exile as torture. Not all of Mussolini's torture methods involved direct physical violence. One of his most psychologically devastating techniques was confino, internal exile to remote islands or isolated villages. Beginning in 1926, the regime formalized this practice through special laws that allowed the government to banish political opponents without trial. Michael Ebner, in his book Ordinary Violence in Mussolini's Italy, documents how over 15,000 Italians were sentenced to confino for political reasons, with thousands more exiled for common offenses. The physical conditions of confino were deliberately harsh. Exiles were sent to barren islands like Ponza, Ventotene, Lipari, and Ustica, places with minimal infrastructure, harsh climates, and limited food supplies. They lived under constant surveillance, required to check in with authorities multiple times daily. But the true torture of confino was psychological. Exiles were torn from their families, communities, and livelihoods. They were placed in unfamiliar environments where locals were often hostile, viewing them as dangerous criminals. The isolation was crushing. Antonio Gramsci, the renowned Marxist philosopher, experienced this torture firsthand. At his trial, the prosecutor famously declared, "We must stop this brain from functioning for 20 years." Sentenced to confino and then prison, Gramsci's health deteriorated dramatically in isolation. He died in 1937, just days after being released, due to his severe medical condition. What made confino particularly insidious was its open-ended nature. Unlike a prison sentence with a defined end, confino could be extended indefinitely at the whim of authorities. This uncertainty created a profound psychological burden. Victims never knew when, or if, they would return home. The regime also used confino to target entire families. When a man was sent into exile, his family often fell into poverty without their breadwinner. Some families chose to follow their loved ones into exile, subjecting themselves to the same harsh conditions rather than remain separated. Through confino, Mussolini created a form of torture that left few visible marks but broke people from within, a method that would later influence dictatorships around the world. Sexual violence and gendered torture. Some of the darkest chapters of Mussolini's torture program targeted victims based on gender, using sexual violence as a weapon of terror and control. Court documents and survivor testimonies reveal that Blackshirts routinely employed sexual torture against political opponents. Male victims were often subjected to genital mutilation. In the spring of 1921, two socialist brothers from Ferrara were abducted, stripped naked, and beaten in the testicles genitals until their organs were mangled beyond recognition. In March 1923, Giuseppe Vitali, a landless laborer from Compiano di Ravenna, was abducted, beaten in front of villagers forced to watch, and then castrated before being thrown into a water canal where he bled to death. These weren't isolated incidents. Alessandro Salupo's research documents how instances of emasculation reflect the traditional strategic aim of feminizing the political enemy and asserting the fascists' dominant masculinity. Women faced their own gendered tortures. Female political prisoners were subjected to sexual assault and public humiliation. In the province of L'Aquila, fascists pulled out the pubic hair of a socialist woman in public, while another woman was forced to endure sexual acts in front of her husband. A common practice against women who opposed the regime was head shaving, a ritual humiliation that marked them as traitors. Some had their heads painted in the green, white, and red of the Italian flag after being shaved, a perverse form of patriotic branding. Perhaps most disturbing was the regime's systematic attack on women's reproductive rights as a form of state-sanctioned torture. After 1926, contraception and abortion were criminalized. Women who sought abortions risked their lives in dangerous underground procedures, while doctors who helped them faced severe punishment. The regime's demographic campaign, which pressured women to have more children for the state, created a form of reproductive coercion that many women experienced as torture. Their bodies were no longer their own, but instruments of the fascist state. This gendered violence served a dual purpose. It punished individual dissidents while reinforcing the regime's patriarchal ideology. By attacking victims in ways that undermined their gender identity, Mussolini's torturers struck at the core of personal autonomy. Psychological warfare and surveillance. Beyond physical torture, Mussolini pioneered psychological methods that terrorized the entire population. Central to this approach was OVRA, Opera Volontaria per la Repressione dell'Antifascismo, the secret police established in 1927. Unlike the crude violence of the early Blackshirts, OVRA operated with chilling efficiency. By the late 1930s, the organization had built a network of approximately 100,000 informants, an astonishing number in a country of Italy's size. This created what historian Mimmo Franzanelli calls a climate of suspicion, where anyone could be an informant, your neighbor, co-worker, or even family member. The psychological impact was devastating. People censored themselves even in private, never knowing who might report them. OVRA's surveillance was comprehensive. They intercepted mail, tapped phones, and maintained extensive files on citizens. The knowledge that you were being watched, or might be, created a form of psychological torture that affected millions of Italians. The regime also weaponized uncertainty. Arrests often occurred in the middle of the night, with no explanation given. Families of the disappeared would receive no information about their loved ones' whereabouts or condition, sometimes for months or years. This technique, what modern psychologists call ambiguous loss, prevented normal grieving and created a perpetual state of anxiety. It was torture by absence, by not knowing. Perhaps most insidious was the regime's manipulation of social bonds. The Fascist Party created a system where advancement required participation in the system. Children were encouraged to report unpatriotic comments by parents. Neighbors were rewarded for informing on neighbors. This deliberate fracturing of social trust created a society where isolation became the norm, a form of psychological torture that affected the entire population. As one survivor later recalled, the worst pain wasn't what they did to you, it was what they made you do to each other. The aftermath of Mussolini's Italy. The tortures of Mussolini's Italy weren't just acts of cruelty. They were sophisticated tools of governance that transformed a nation. Through physical pain, public humiliation, isolation, and psychological manipulation, the fascist regime broke individual bodies to control the collective body of Italy. What makes these methods particularly disturbing is how effective they were. By 1930, most open resistance had been crushed. Millions of Italians lived in a state of what psychologists now call learned helplessness. a condition where people who have experienced prolonged trauma stop believing they can change their circumstances. The legacy of these tortures extended far beyond Italy's borders. Dictators around the world studied and adopted Mussolini's methods. The psychological techniques pioneered by Ovra influenced secret police organizations from the Gestapo to modern authoritarian regimes. Yet perhaps the most troubling aspect of Mussolini's torture program was how ordinary it became. Violence that would have been unthinkable in 1920 was normalized by 1930. The boundaries of acceptable state behavior shifted gradually, then suddenly. This raises uncomfortable questions for our own time. How easily could a society slide into accepting state violence? What seemingly small steps might lead toward institutionalized cruelty? And most importantly, would we recognize these steps before it was too late? The tortures of Mussolini's Italy weren't just historical atrocities. They were warnings, reminders of how fragile democratic norms can be when fear replaces law as the foundation of governance. If you found this exploration of history's darkest chapters valuable, do support our channel by subscribing and sharing this video. What other historical periods should we examine through this lens? Let us know in the comments below.